You're talking about what a world would look like if it was governed by the left brain. This is from your book about master and emissary. As a result, individuals would be ironed out, and identification would be by categories, socioeconomic groups, races, sexes, and so on, which would also feel themselves to be implicitly or explicitly in competition with, resentful of one another. Paranoia and lack of trust would come to be the pervading stance within society, both between individuals and between such groups, and would be the stance of government toward its people. Is that what you think has happened?
Yes, to some extent. That's a small excerpt from a longer piece in which I talk about many things, and I say, let us do the thought experiment, what the world would look like if the left hemispheric understanding, such as it is, was dominant. And I then effectively paint a picture of the modern world. And sometimes in lectures, I expound this about 25 differences between a properly understood world and a purely left hemispheric vision. And then I end by saying, after I've very obviously delineated the world we're in, well, thank God we don't live in that world. But of course we do. And so it's a world where the broad vision has been lost, where things are either or, black and white, there's no shades of meaning, taking into account opposites. Everything is linearly understood. There's an overgrowth of bureaucracy and administration. There is this seeing of things in abstract categories rather than understanding them in a full contextual whole. And in a full contextual whole, things can change their meaning completely. They can seem to mean the reverse of what they are when they're decontextualized. And in the world in which we send messages around that are only 180 characters or whatever they are, I'm terribly fuddy-duddy. I don't really know about these things. I don't use social media at all. But I'm lucky I have somebody who does it for me, which is a bit of a cheat. But anyway, it allows me to think and write.
Me too.
But so we would be in that world. And the thing about paranoia is this. The left hemisphere is somewhat paranoid because it knows its job is to control things so that it can get things and have power over them. Its value is power and utility. And if it doesn't feel that everything is under control, it gets very anxious about it, which is why I suggest that in such a society, government would see its job as controlling everything maximally, and there would be a paranoid sense that, we need to have CCTV cameras everywhere, we need to monitor people's Twitter feeds or whatever it is. That is the world we're going into. It's terrifying. And it's absolutely consonant with what happens in neurology. So when people have right hemisphere strokes, their left hemisphere is doing all the functioning. They tend to be rather controlling. They tend to be anxious and paranoid. And indeed, schizophrenia, which famously gives rise to paranoid delusions, is very much due to overdrive in the left hemisphere and some sort of hypofunction or dysfunction of the right hemisphere, which is not making its proper contribution.
So the hemispheres that you've explained to us are much older than the birth of modern society or bureaucracy.
Yes.
Why has this happened?
Well, I think this comes back to my idea that it's to do with being able to grab and get, which is so important that one whole half of the brain is dedicated to focusing on a detail in order to be able to manipulate it. But the other part of the brain's got to be looking out for everything else, which is the other 357 degrees of the 360-degree arc. And so the right hemisphere sees a coherent, sustained vision. It is vigilant for whatever there may be. It doesn't only see what it expects to find, whereas the left hemisphere sees only what it's already focused on finding, and therefore is likely to be blind to other things. So they need one another. And as I say, it goes back 700 million years, as far as we know, to a sea creature called Nematostella vectensis, the oldest creature extant that's had its neural network examined by Thomas Holstein in Heidelberg, and he calls it the ancestor of the mammalian brain. And it's already asymmetrical in this way because it's having to do these two things of looking out for stuff that it wants and looking out for predators. But of course, in us, it reaches hugely more significant separation. So one sees an atomistic world in which things are separate, they are fragments, they have no context, they have no meaning, and until we give them a meaning, they are basically inanimate, static, and they can be fully known. Whereas in the right hemisphere's world, nothing can be fully known. It can only be a relative degree of certainty. Everything is ultimately interconnected and can't be just wrenched out of context. Everything has an embodied nature. Everything actually flows. And the world is an animate one with which we feel in connection. So these are two hugely different pictures when we get to the human being trying to understand a world. And one of them is open to, if you like, a non-material understanding or a non-grossly material understanding, and the other to an understanding that engages the fact that there are values and purposes that transcend the purely reductionist picture.
Yeah, reductionist, you use that word quite a lot. I'm wondering if choices, big choices, human beings have made are part of the thing here. So in Hobbes' Leviathan, there's a sentence I like. Reason, then, is but a scout or a spy to range abroad and find the way to the thing desired. Is that him just making the left brain the whole of it? There was a movement in philosophy, right? Machiavelli writes something about the ancient philosophers wasting their time building imaginary republics. And then the sentiment is, we should just fix this one. Mm-hmm. Let's get on with it. To analyze is something different than to know. I mean, it's a way of knowing, you rightly pointed out, but it changes things too. So has the left brain ascended, the left hemisphere, I'm learning your language, has it ascended because we wanted it to?
Broadly speaking, yes. So in the second half of The Master and His Emissary, I trace the history of the West from the Greeks through the Romans. I rather skip over what's called the Dark Ages, so we don't call it that anymore, through to the beginnings of the Renaissance and from then onwards. And I believe there have been a number of shifts at the Reformation, with the Enlightenment, with Romanticism, with modernism and postmodernism, in which the left and the right calibrated something. There were somewhat pendulum swings. But Machiavelli was a very utilitarian philosopher. I mean, what he recommended really was seeing things in an instrumental way, because he thought that was the wise way to get to a position of power and be able to exert what influence you have, for good or ill. But this idea of utility and power, this is the only value of the left hemisphere. That is its purpose. And I believe that there are many other values, and I think the best unfolding of this is in the work of Max Scheler, the early 20th century German phenomenological philosopher, whom Heidegger described as the greatest philosopher alive at the time, who had a pyramid of values that ascends from utility and power at the bottom up through what he called the values of life, or the Lebenswerte, which are things like generosity, magnanimity, bravery, fidelity, up through the geistige Werte, the spiritual or intellectual virtues of beauty, goodness, and truth, and then to das Heilige, the holy, at the top. And the way things are constructed now, the real scientific reductionists say that our ideas about these things, the holy, the beautiful, the good, and the true, are just fictions we made up, and they were made up by people who wanted to make a power grab. It's a very reduced, kind of terribly reduced, laughably reduced version of what the human story has been and what a human being is.